All right, you guys, we're going to continue on with the next example. So this problem says find all solutions of cotangent x times cotangent x plus 3 equals 1 over the interval from 0 to 2 pi. All right, so remember the first step is always to determine whether or not the equation that you've been given is linear or quadratic. So in order for me to make that determination, I'm going to need to multiply everything out in this problem. So the first thing I'm going to do is write it out. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is multiply or distribute this cotangent x to all of the terms that are inside of the parentheses. So that gives me cotangent x times cotangent x. That's going to be cotangent squared x. And then cotangent times 3 is 3 cotangent x equals 1. All right. Once I multiplied everything out, I can see that I have a degree of 2 here, which lets me know that this problem is quadratic. So that lets me know that I need to handle this problem like it was quadratic. So the first thing I need to do is set everything equal to 0. I need to put it in standard form. So that 1 that's on the right-hand side of the equation, I'm going to go ahead and move that over to the left. So I'm going to subtract it from both sides. So that's going to give me cotangent squared x plus 3 cotangent x minus 1 equals 0. Okay. Now, since it's quadratic, remember you can use any of the methods that you want to solve the quadratic. You could factor it if it's factorable. You could use a quadratic formula. Okay. So in this case, I would need, if I were going to factor it, let me change my pen color. That would mean that I would need factors of 1 that either add or subtract to give me the coefficient of the middle term, which is 3. That's not possible. There's no factors of 1 that are going to give me 3. So it's not factorable. So I'm going to have to use something else. So we know that the quadratic formula can solve any quadratic that I'm given. So I'm going to go ahead and use that. Okay. So remember that the formula for the quadratic formula is as follows. X equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Okay. So in order to use a quadratic formula, you just need to know what the coefficients are in your problem. Since my quadratic is already in standard form, then I'm going to look at the coefficients and label them appropriately. So for me, a is equal to 1, b is equal to 3, and c is equal to negative 1. So I'm going to go ahead and take those coefficients and I'm going to plug them into the quadratic formula. All right. So when I do that, I'm going to have negative b, which would be negative 3 plus or minus the square root of b squared, which is 3 squared, minus 4 times 1 times negative 1, all over 2 times 1. So that gives me negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 9. Negative 4 times negative 1 is positive 4, all over 2. And 9 plus 4 is 13, so that's negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 13, all over 2. Okay. Now, the quadratic formula says that x is equal to this quotient. Okay. But for us, not only are we solving for x, our x is actually cotangent x. Okay. So that's what this equals. Cotangent x equals this quantity. So at the end of the day, we're looking to solve x, but x is embedded inside of this trig function. So we know the only way we're going to be able to get it out is if we use the inverse function. So we have x equals inverse cotangent of this quantity, negative 3 plus or minus square root of 13 over 2. Okay. Now, that's not a standard value that's on our unit circle. So the only way that we're going to be able to figure out what that is, we're going to have to plug it into our calculator. Okay. Now, also remember, because we use the quadratic formula, inside of this parentheses is actually 2 answers. This plus or minus here is going to split this into 2 separate answers. One of these answers is going to be negative 3 plus the square root of 13 over 2. And the other one's going to be negative 3 minus the square root of 13 over 2. So I'm going to plug them into the calculator individually. So I have two answers. One is going to be inverse cotangent of -3 plus square root of 13 over 2. And the other one is inverse cotangent of -3 minus square root of 13 over 2. Okay. All right, so I'm going to plug those into the calculator, figure out what I get. But before I do that, let me remind you. So our calculator, if you recall, only has 3 inverse trig buttons. It only has inverse sine, inverse cosine, and inverse tangent. There is not going to be an inverse cotangent button on our calculator. So you have to refer back to those fixes that I showed you earlier of how to plug that in. So when I go to plug in cotangent inverse of this quantity, all right, when I plug that into the calculator, I'm actually going to put this in its place. I'm going to say, wait, let's look. Our answers need to be in radians. So I'm going to say the fix is pi over 2 minus inverse tangent of -3 plus square root of 13 over 2. That's going to give me my first answer. And the second one's going to give me pi over 2 minus inverse tangent of -3 minus square root of 13 over 2. All right, so let's plug those in individually to see what we get. So let me switch to our calculator. All right, so the first one, I'm going to say pi over 2. All right, so there's a couple of ways that you can do this. All right, I'm going to put that in parentheses. So I'm going to say second pi divided by 2. Make sure your calculator's in radians. I believe that I already am. So let me check that. Yep, I am. Good. All right, pi over 2, we said minus inverse tangent. Remember, to get your inverse trig buttons, you're going to hit second. Then for me, I'm going to hit the tangent key. And that top quantity for me was -3 plus the square root of 13. And then divided by 2. Close parentheses, enter. So my first answer is 1.276. I'm just going to round that to 3 decimal places. So 1.2, well, I'll round it to 2 decimal places. Doesn't matter. 1.28. It's going to be my first one. And then to get my second one, I need to change that quantity that was inside of the parentheses to minus square root of 13. So let me go ahead and pull that back up again. I'm going to recall that answer, that entry. And I'm going to change that sign to a minus and press enter. And my other answer is 2.85. All right. 2.85. All right, so those are our two answers. Let's see, make sure we answer the problem, find all the solutions over the interval from 0 to 2 pi. Yep. So those are our two answers, 1.28 and 2.85. So let me go ahead and highlight those for you. There's our first answer. And there's our second. Awesome.